Good morning, everybody. We're going to take a look at the story of the Passover this morning. And this quote in Colossians chapter 2 speaks about all things in the law in terms of holy days and feasts were a shadow to point us to Jesus. So the focus is on Jesus, but it's important to note that if a person chooses to follow principles of the Sabbath or to keep any of the feasts, we ought not pass judgment upon anybody that does that, because they were all there as things to help a person concentrate their mind or think about God's purpose in Jesus. And it's no different really to what we do Sunday by Sunday when we break bread and drink wine. We take two symbols, which are essentially only symbols, to help us to focus our mind upon the real, the substance, and that is Jesus. So all of these things, and even our memorial feast, is really only a shadow. It's only something for us to help our minds focus on the substance. So there's a lot of feasts that I think are kind of interesting that, perhaps we could celebrate. And, one of the things that Jesus said to Thomas is he said, Thomas, you've seen me and you've believed. But blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. Yeah. And obviously that's us. And we have these things in the law, but we also have these things in terms of our own memorial feast, which are really designed to help us see Jesus. So let's have a look quickly at the story of the feasts and the festive season or the festivals for the nation of Israel. So when you come to the story in Exodus chapter 12, it begins what becomes a new calendar. The religious calendar is introduced for Israel, and it's during the month of Abib, which was essentially the fourth month of their civil calendar year. God suddenly says to them through Moses, this month is going to be a new year for you. This is wholly new, which is, you have to kind of think how amazing or important that was. Imagine if we're sitting here now, April, and all of a sudden we had this message that basically said, as of now, this is January 1. We are now going to make this the beginning of your new year. So, so for the Jews, this changed everything. And so when we look at the Jewish calendar, it's interesting. It's based on the lunar year as opposed to what we would know as the Gregorian calendar. And the difference between the Gregorian calendar and the lunar calendar is the Gregorian calendar is based on the Earth's rotation around the sun. So it's based on the movement of the Earth in relationship to the sun, and it's based on a 356 day per year, called 356 days per year, and then they catch up obviously by using leap years, and that's how they catch up in terms of the dates or the times on the Earth's rotation around the sun. Called the Gregorian calendar, by the way, because of Pope Gregory, the introduction of it by Pope Gregory. But for the Jews, everything was based around the lunar calendar, and that was based around the cycles of the moon, which is really interesting because, if you like, the moon was to rule the night, wasn't it? Whereas the sun rules the day. And for Israel, the importance was their entire calendar was revolving around the night, if you like, the moon and the night. So all their agricultural years and all their festivals are based around the moon. And you'll get comments like in the Psalms where it says, blow up the trumpet in the new moon. Literally, it's the new month, but obviously that's how they began a month. And the thing with the moon, of course, is it waxes and wanes. It changes in in terms of the light it emanates and the reflection of the sun at the time, of how much sun reflects or how much the moon sees sun, if you like. The lunar calendar is based on a 354-day year, and that's why the Jews add the intercalendary months every 2 to 3 years. Sorry about this. So when you get to Genesis 1 verse 5, it is interesting, almost right at the beginning, before the story of Exodus chapter 12, it is as though God had already introduced the principle of the lunar calendar, because in Genesis 1 verse 5, when God called light day, he called darkness night. He then said the evening and the morning were the first day. And you'll notice that order is that we would normally say, morning and night. But in Genesis 1 verse 5, it's really saying, night and day. So night is preceding the day, and that's how the day is ordered. Evening and morning became the first day. So if you like, the evidence of the lunar calendar, which God established for the nation of Israel, was right there at the beginning. Night preceding the day, which is very significant scripturally. So I'm not sure how well you can see this calendar, but this is a calendar, an agricultural calendar for Israel in terms of their festivals and their planting. And just see if I can move I don't think I can, or maybe I can. There you go. So can we see my mouse on there? Not sure. No. I see it on my screen. Okay. So everything in terms of their calendar. Sorry?
I saw it.
We can see it. Yes.
Oh, you did see it. Okay, I'll take it back. There we go. If you could see it, I'm taking it back on there. So you'll see Abib, the month Nisan here, and this is their beginning of year, their calendar year. And as you move around, you'll see the different crops. So it started with barley, wheat, figs, the beginning of the summer fruits, the final ingathering of dates, grapes and figs, and then there's the ploughing and sowing and toiling, and it goes back again. So much of their harvest crops happen within 6 months. So this is obviously the time of the day, and then the night, of course, is where everything is prepared for the following year. You might see it a little bit better when we move on to this slide, which I think is a little bit clearer. So this one here shows their festivals. Well, you notice that these are the biblical recorded festivals that are there, and you'll notice that if you follow it round, there's actually 8 festivals. But in the Old Testament, Hanukkah, or the Festival of Lights, is not part of the festivals recorded in the law. So there were actually only 7 specific festivals or feasts that are mentioned. And that's the order of them as you go round. It starts with Passover, Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Firstfruits, the Feast of Weeks, or what we know as Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, or Rosh Hashanah, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, and then finally the Feast of Tabernacles. These are the 7 feasts that are mentioned in the law of Moses. In this order, it starts, and it's quite specifically this order. So, Passover starts, that's introduced to us in Exodus chapter 12. Unleavened bread starts, and it's in conjunction with Passover. The day after commences the first day of unleavened bread. The Feast of Firstfruits also happens in that first week. and that's designated by what day happens to be the Sabbath during that first week, and it comes the day after the Sabbath. Feast of Pentecost is measured against the Feast of Firstfruits. So Pentecost is 7 weeks after the first day of the Firstfruits. Then you've got a long wait, really, between Pentecost and the Feast of Trumpets, which happens in the beginning of the 7th month. And then the Day of Atonement happens 10 days later on Yom Kippur, and then just a short time later, 5 days later, begins the Feast of Tabernacles, which runs from the 15th through to the 22nd or 21st, but there is a special added day in there. So those are the 7 feasts. Now they have a real significance, and they follow through a real prophetic overview, if you like. Everything starts with Passover, and obviously that's, we've seen the fulfillment of this feast in terms of the crucifixion of God's Lamb, the offering of Jesus as the Passover Lamb. The Feast of Unleavened Bread was a time where, basically they had to clean out and make sure there was no leaven found, and that they celebrated this feast for immediately after the Passover, and it's the symbol really of Christ's body in the tomb. And then in the middle of this feast, right in the middle, is the Feast of Firstfruits, and it could have fallen on any particular day during this week, but it's most likely, in terms of Jesus' resurrection, that the Feast of Firstfruits fell perfectly, that when Jesus rose from the dead, Sunday morning was the day after the Sabbath, which was a real Sabbath, obviously the Saturday, and that became the Feast of Firstfruits, and it fits perfectly to the prophetic overview as is found in the story of the feasts. Then, of course, we know the Feast of Pentecost, which happens 50 days later, which was really Acts chapter 2, the beginning of the 1st century ecclesia. The Feast of Trumpets, as I said, is a long wait. So after you get the story of the birth of the 1st century ecclesia, you've got a long period of time before there's another feast. And I think that's typical of the gospel being preached to all the world. So what begins at Jerusalem and then goes through Judah and Samaria to the uttermost parts of the earth and is seen at Pentecost, then spreads. And you've got the long night of the Gentiles where the gospel spreads. And then the final 3 feasts, I don't think have really seen their fulfillment. They're all about the time when Jesus will come back, which I think is very close. So the Feast of Trumpets begins on the 1st day of the 7th month, and it's a call to the whole nation to prepare for Yom Kippur, which happens 10 days later. So the Feast of Trumpets, typical of the resurrection. The trumpet shall sound, and the dead in Christ shall rise. And then on the 10th day of the 7th month is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. That's the day of judgment, the day of fasting, where an offering was made for the nation for all their sins of omission, were presented before God, and there was a universal blanket forgiveness over the entire nation. So it really speaks of the time of great compassion of God, that he was able to forgive a nation for all the things that had taken place between these 2 years on each Day of Atonement. And so then after that, of course, they have 5 days to get ready, because now they're at a time of great happiness. So the greatest, I think, of all celebrations is the Feast of Tabernacles. So this is the celebration which remembers God's compassion and mercy, bringing them through. It remembers the Passover, and they all dwell together in a picture, really, of beauty under their vine and fig tree, as it were. But in this case, they dwelt under booths, and they made themselves a special place where they could all come together. So that's kind of how the prophetic overview of the 7 feasts go, and there is real structure to them, and they fit really well. And when you look at the story of the feasts, you'll see this, and you can follow through each of those. We're only really going to focus this morning on the first of those feasts. So this is all to do with the spring feasts in Israel. Obviously, autumn now here, spring in Israel, and it has to do with their cereal crops. So it has to do with the barley and the wheat, that which is sown in the ground. And there's real emphasis made of this point when you look at Exodus chapter 12 and Leviticus chapter 23, that this is a celebration of that which was sown in the earth, and is quite distinct from the latter harvest, which is the summer fruits of the dates, figs, and grapes, and that's called and that's referred to as the fruit of their labor, the fruit of their hands. So the cereal crops are what goes into the earth, and then the summer fruit is what comes off the trees. And, you know, like you can look at this just in the simple aspect of bread and wine. So when you look at bread, it's part of the cereal crop which goes into the earth and comes out of the earth, which is that earthly, natural aspect of the Lord Jesus Christ and of ourselves. And then at the latter harvest, it's the summer fruits, figs, dates, and grapes, significantly enough. And of course, these are the fruits which come off the trees, and that represents obviously the new covenant in Christ of life, which doesn't come out of the earth, it comes off the produce that has already come out of the earth, or the trees as such. So in the festival, the spring festivals in Israel, this is how it structures. So as we said, on the 14th day of Nisan, or Abib, those are the two words which are used to describe the first month in Israel. On the 14th day of Nisan is Passover, and then immediately after it is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where they were to clean out all the leaven. And the reason when we think about leaven and bread, we think about the concept of sin, because Jesus talks about, you know, the leaven of unrighteousness, or the leaven of hypocrisy. And when you think about the story of the death of Jesus, it was about making an end of sin. He put away transgression, and he finished transgression. And when he cried, "It is done, it is finished," from the cross, he had finished his work, and he had put away sin in his life. And the remembrance of the Feast of Unleavened Bread for us is not really us putting away sin, it's remembering that he has put away sin. So we go through from Passover, the lamb, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then, as we said, in the middle of the Feast of Unleavened Bread is what's known as the Feast of Firstfruits, and you'll find that in Leviticus chapter 23. So the Feast of Firstfruits was when, you know, they brought the very first part of the crop that had just come up of the barley, and they went and they waved it before God and presented it. It was pretty useless to eat at that stage, but they gave it to God. And there's significance here in that the story of Passover is all about the first fruit or firstborn. So we'll come back to that in a minute. And then we're not going to talk about the Feast of Pentecost, but as we said, that was measured after the Feast of Firstfruits. For whenever that day fell, that's when they marked out the 50 days after, 7 sevens, and on the 50th day became the Feast of Pentecost, which in this case was, or in the New Testament, was the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. So that's an introduction to the structure of the feasts, particularly the spring feasts. And now we want to sort of think about the story of Passover. So the emphasis in 1 Corinthians 5 verse 7, of course, is that Christ is our Passover. Everything in this story about Passover points to Jesus. In the record of Exodus, we have to realize that Passover is a culmination of 10 plagues. It's the climax of all the plagues that happened in Egypt. And when you look at all the plagues that happened in Egypt, you'll see that they were actually plagues which came as a direct attack, if you like, by God against all the false gods of Egypt. So in Egypt, they had multiple gods. They had the god of the Nile. They had the god for frogs. They had the god for gnats and lice. They had the god for flies. They had gods for rain and boils and hailstorms and locusts and darkness. So they had all different gods. And the last god that they had was really Pharaoh. He was deemed to be a god. And when you think about the story of Passover, it's all about the story of these plagues which came upon Egypt were God trying to soften Pharaoh's heart, because Pharaoh was a hard man. And you sort of think, well, okay, in what way was Pharaoh hard? Well, it's obvious that he couldn't, he didn't want to let Israel go. But it's not just that. It's that when you think about a ruler over his own people, these plagues were totally decimating the economy of Egypt and were having a real effect upon people's health and well-being. And the reason Pharaoh did not want to let the children of Israel go was because the children of Israel were the lifeblood of the economy of Egypt. He relied on them and their slave labor in order to make himself and his people powerful. And so he was not prepared to sacrifice his economy for the welfare of his people. I think that's kind of interesting when you think about the coronavirus right now, is that that's the question which every nation of the world is facing right at the moment. The question of the economy versus the health and well-being of people. Are nations prepared to sacrifice their economy to save lives of people? And some are doing a fantastic job, others are doing a pretty poor job. And you can see that some leaders are not willing to sacrifice their economy, and the end result is not good, because all of a sudden this virus is beginning to run rampant in those places where the leaders have chosen the economy over health. So it's really interesting. That's the hardness of Pharaoh's heart, is that in all of this he was so hard that there was no love for his people at all, because despite all of these things, he wouldn't let the children of Israel go. And so God was going to bring about this final judgment. In the night of darkness, God was going to bring about the death of the firstborn of Pharaoh. Just a little quick digression. I have these every now and again, but there's something in this story which I really like, and that is that in Exodus chapter 8 verse 19, you'll notice, if you remember the story, Pharaoh's magicians were able to imitate the first couple of plagues in regards to the blood and the frogs. And it's not until it gets into the removal of the frogs from all the land of Egypt that the magicians turned around and said to Pharaoh, "Oh, this is none other than the finger of God." And Pharaoh's heart was hardened and he hearkened not to them. So even the magicians got to the stage where they had to acknowledge that really they were fakes and charlatans, and that they were just imitating what they could, but then when it was too great, they turned around and says, "This is the finger of God." Which I find quite interesting, because here we've got a worldwide virus that's sweeping the world, and hospitals are full of people with this contagious disease. What I'd like to know is, where are all the faith healers? You know, there's a whole multitude of faith healers out there that are prepared to go and lay hands on people. I haven't heard of any of them going through those hospitals. Where are the faith healers to lay hands on those people that have got that virus? All of a sudden, they've gone very quiet. And I think, you know, just and that's a bit of an indication of the charlatans of our day. Jesus picks up this very quote of the magicians when he is challenged of casting out devils, and the religious leaders of the day turned around and says, "Oh, you cast out devils by Beelzebub," which, by the way, was, you know, essentially an Egyptian god. And Jesus said, "If I, with the finger of God, cast out devils, no doubt the kingdom is come upon you." And so he quotes this quote, and that's all about the reason Jesus cast out devils and demons as such, because it was showing God's authority over them, just like God was showing his authority over the plagues of Egypt. So we come to the last plague. That was a little digression. And we come to the story of Passover. And I think this is a real key thing when thinking about Passover. You have to think it's the backdrop of what it's set against. Because Exodus chapter 12 says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt will I execute judgment." So this was a pretty terrifying night. It was a sobering night, because of course here was the children of Israel stuck in their little homes, and outside was the destroying angel. Another little digression, I guess, on the lamb. They were commanded, of course, to take a lamb, and the Passover revolves around lambs. It doesn't revolve around Easter bunnies. The lamb is almost the only animal mentioned in Passover. There was another one. Going to talk about that on Sunday morning for the exhort. But the lamb is the focus of Passover. And on the 10th day of the month, the children of Israel were told 4 days before Passover to bring a lamb inside their house. Again, you kind of imagine these families in lockdown, shut up inside their house, and they bring a lamb inside their house, and the family gets, you know, to know the lamb, and the kids get to know the lamb. And I can imagine kids, you know, would love a cute lamb. And so it was a very difficult night when they would then kill that lamb. And everybody in that household had to partake of that lamb. And you can imagine some kids would have been quite disturbed by that, might have wanted to go and hide in their rooms. But it was up to the family, the father, to explain to them the story that this lamb represents God's offering of his firstborn. We, of course, see this in Jesus, where he was interrogated and inspected by Pilate, and Pilate came out and said, "I find no fault in him." he was the spotless lamb. Again, on a side note, a little bit of a digression again, but when Jesus was first proclaimed and the shepherds heard the good message, it says in Luke chapter 2 that there were shepherds abiding in the field. An angel appeared to them and said to them, I bring you good news, which will be for all people. For unto you is born in the city of David, of course, which was Bethlehem, a Saviour who is Christ the Lord. And this is going to be the sign. You will identify this child because you'll find him wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. So the shepherds were given a specific sign of which to identify the Messiah, the promised one that would come. And the sign was you would find the baby wrapped in swaddling clothes, lying in a manger. And there's something really interesting about this is when you look at the Old Testament story about Bethlehem, Micah says, thou Bethlehem Ephratah, you were little among the clans of Judah, but from you would come one who is to be ruler over Israel. And then in Micah chapter 4, in the same context, a little bit earlier, it says, and you, tower of the flock of the hill of the daughter of Zion, to you it shall come, the former dominion shall come, kingship for the daughter of Zion. Now, what they've discovered in Bethlehem was that in the time of Jesus, the priesthood had shepherds which looked after flocks in that area so that they had lambs for obviously the offering of the main festivals, in particular Passover. And the Passover lambs were being raised or reared in Bethlehem. And the idea behind a manger is the fact that it is an animal shelter, and it's highly likely that this was one of the places where they were actually raising lambs for Passover. And they said what happened was when they found a lamb, history says when they found a lamb that was perfect without blemish, they would identify it and separate it, and they would wrap that lamb in the old linen garments of the priests. So the linen garments that the priests had used and discarded were used as swaddling clothes for the selected Passover lamb. Now, whether that's the case or not with Jesus, not quite sure, but it was definitely a sign to the shepherds that they would find this child in an animal shelter wrapped in swaddling clothes, and that was how they were going to identify the Passover lamb. So I think there's good reason historically to believe that that's the case, and perhaps the significance about Jesus being born in a manger. So we take the lesson from the Passover lamb about being spotless. What other lessons can we learn from the story of Passover? Well, here's a big one that you learn from the Passover. It's about loving your neighbor. And it's really emphasized in Exodus chapter 12 about the relationship that the house or the Jews would have with their neighbor during Passover. It says in Exodus chapter 12, verse 4 and 5, if a household's too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor nearest to his house are to take one according to the number of persons in them, according to what a man shall eat. And you'll divide the lamb, and the lamb shall be unblemished male, a year old, and you may take it from the sheep, from either the sheep or the goats. So, you buy a full lamb, and that's quite a big meal. And so it was important that, they weren't too greedy, and they didn't want to waste the lamb. And so neighbors would join with neighbors. And so this was a festival which extended to a bubble and perhaps a neighbor bubble, which which is kind of interesting when we think about some of our rules around bubbles today. Here we are in our home at Passover right now in our bubble, and you sort of think, well, how can we interact with our neighbor? Well, I found this on a Jewish community website, which I just thought was very interesting. This is letters which they send out that says, hello, if you are self-isolating, I can help. My name is, I live nearby. If you contact me, if you are self-isolating due to coronavirus, I am able to help you with grocery shopping, a chat over the phone, posting letters, other supplies. Please take care to follow government guidelines and make sure you offer help in a safe way. Love your neighbor as yourself. So I just thought that was kind of a beautiful little thing, particularly in relationship to Passover. So that's one of the aspects of Passover, and I think that's really important when we think about both in the New Testament and the Old Testament. The emphasis is upon the fact that this is the Lord's Passover. It wasn't the Jews' Passover. This was God's Passover. He had ownership of it. They didn't have rights to it. It was something that he gave them, and it belonged to him. And because of that, he sets the rules, and the rules were specifically about who was able to partake of it. And it was an open invite. God said anybody in their midst was able to partake of Passover, providing they were circumcised. So that was the only requirement, was circumcision, but it could have been a stranger amongst them. Anybody could share in that meal. Gentiles were able, and this is the first kind of open thing that we see, the Gentiles fully being involved in a feast. And that's because obviously it points forward to Jesus. And I think Hezekiah is perhaps the ultimate example of this, because when you look at the story of Hezekiah's Passover in 2 Chronicles chapter 30, Hezekiah saw this principle really well, and he sent messages right through the land, right up to Israel, in the land of Samaria and Ephraim, right up around northern Galilee, which I think is where Isaiah 9 comes from. The people that dwelt in darkness saw a great light, because he wrote letters to them all and invited them to come and to share the Passover. And when you think about that, how did that go down in Judah? You know, like, it's pretty clear that the Samaritans were already very corrupt. They had a lot of involvement because of the fact that in Ahaz's day, Tiglath-Pileser had displaced many of them and brought in a mixed race of people, and they worshipped multiple gods. In fact, there was 5 different gods found in the area of Samaria. So you can imagine in Judah, the people would have said, oh, Hezekiah, I don't think that's a great idea. I don't think you should invite those people down. They're corrupt. They've got wrong doctrine. I think they're unclean. I don't think you should invite them to this Passover. And Hezekiah was able to say, you know, this is the Lord's Passover. This is his feast. And I think in this is a really powerful lesson for us about our ability to share Christ, and understand that we don't have rights to the Lord's Passover. It's his Passover. And that invitation is open. And empathy and kindness, well, they were the principles that Hezekiah showed. So that's one of the lessons we can take from Passover. And in this, we find this story in Acts chapter 4, when the people saw the boldness of Peter and John, they perceived they were unlearned and ignorant men, and marveled and took knowledge that they had been with Jesus. So in the story of love your neighbor, the first witness of Passover is that you witness to your neighbors, you witness to your community, so that people can see that we have been with Jesus. The second part of Passover, of course, was that in killing that lamb, they were to take the blood and they were to put it over their doorposts and over the lintel of their doors. And obviously in this was the story of the fact of being totally protected and enshrouded by the blood of God's offering. And the reason why, it says, so that when the angel of death passed by, it would get to that door and it would move on. So the second part of Passover is not just to be recognized that our friends and our neighbors might see Jesus amongst us. It's that God can identify Jesus in our homes, in our lives. And our homes and our lives ought to be totally shrouded in the blood of Christ so that we might be protected. Because there will come a time, and the reality is that we may be witnessing it. And this quote here, "Come, my people, enter thou into the chambers, shut the doors about thee, hide yourself for a little moment until the indignation be past." That is a verse which encapsulates Passover. And as I mentioned in the last study I did, I think that during the time of the destruction of the Assyrian, Sennacherib and all his forces by the angel of death in one night, they were actually keeping a Passover. There was a real Passover that was going on, and people had hidden themselves in the chamber. So when you think about Passover, there's something that is really dramatic that is kind of sobering, because it's a celebration of a family. It would appear to be an enjoyable time, yet God said you were to have that Passover fully clothed with your sandals on, with your staff in your hand, ready to run, ready to go. So it was kind of an anxious time. And in fact, it says you should eat the Passover in haste, ready to go. Because during this time when they were sharing this meal together, the most blood-curdling, scary cry and noise was sounded throughout the whole of the land of Egypt. Here they were dwelling quietly in the land of Goshen, and a noise suddenly broke the evening. And from every house in Egypt, this blood-curdling cry of deep anguish was heard. And you know, I think we perhaps don't appreciate our true relationship with Christ because we've never heard that cry. I.e., when we face the judgment seat and we receive the incredible blessing of having those words, "Well done, my good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your Lord," that there is going to be a whole group of people that are rejected, and it says, and there'll be weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. Now, I don't know whether we'll see that rejection, but going by Passover, I wouldn't be surprised if we hear that rejection. And the true value of our salvation will suddenly be real. We will realize what it means to be in Christ when we see or when we hear the alternative of rejection. And I think that's a pretty sobering thought when you think about Passover. Isaiah also says in the previous verse, it says these words, "Thy dead men shall live together, with my dead body shall they arise. Awake and sing, ye that dwell in the dust, for thy dew is the dew of herbs, and the earth shall cast out her dead." It's not the first time this analogy is used. Psalm 110 says, "Your people will be willing in the day of your power, in the beauty of holiness. From the womb of the morning, you have the dew of youth." So you have this concept of being shut about, come my people, enter into the chambers. And then out of this picture of the dew and the womb of the morning. Micah chapter 5, the same thing. The remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many people as the dew from the Lord, and as showers upon the grass that tarrieth not for man, or waiteth for the sons of man. By the way, Micah chapter 5, totally context of Passover, what we looked at. Thou Bethlehem Ephratah, out of you shall come him that shall be ruler. So Micah chapter 5 is the story of Passover. Psalm 110, I believe, is the story of Melchizedek and the story of the birth of a nation. And Isaiah 26 is without doubt the story of Passover and the birth of a nation. And all of that is related to the dew of the morning, or the dew of the womb. What does it mean? What's that about? Well, as we said, the Jewish day goes from night to day. And in the darkness of Egypt's night, and in the destruction of the firstborn of Egypt, out of that was going to come the birth of a nation, the birth of new life. And that's actually what, of course, happens in terms of Jesus going into the tomb at Passover and coming out of the tomb on the firstfruits. And it's what happens to all of us in our life in Jesus. And the dew, Dr. Thomas makes the comment that the dew is the most beautiful of all scriptural similitudes, because dew is formed in the middle of the night. In the darkness of the night, when no one can see, dew is formed. It forms secretly around a particle of dust. So every dewdrop represents one dust particle that's been completely enshrouded by water. And the dust particle can hardly even be seen. We have this treasure in earthen vessels. And the only time it is seen is when the sun suddenly appears. And the moment the sun breaks over the eastern portals of the sky, every dewdrop at that morning break suddenly sparkles with divine-like refraction. And the glorious refraction that comes from those dewdrop particles is suddenly witnessed in the birth of the morning. And out of that is the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth. And it speaks of resurrection, which is exactly what happened with the nation of Israel. This is another picture of it here. You remember Mark chapter 6 and John chapter 6 is the feeding of the 5,000, and the story is Passover. So they're sitting there at Passover with Jesus, and he feeds the 5,000, and then he goes walking across the water straight after Passover. And it reminds you of Israel crossing the Red Sea straight after Passover. And the sea is stormy and rough. And then in the midst of the sea, of course, somebody begins to sink in the midst of the sea. And immediately Jesus said to Peter, Peter said, Lord, it is you, command me to come out on the water. And then, of course, Peter begins to sink in the water. And an arm reaches down and lifts him out of the water, and immediately they are on the other side. And then Jesus gives this whole story of the Passover. So in this story in John chapter 6, Mark chapter 6, is the story again of the crossing of the Red Sea, the birth of a nation in a moment. So that's the introduction of our story of Passover. One other thing I'd just like to share with you, I gave this introduction series for the first time a number of years ago in Malaysia. And when I spoke about the Feast of Trumpets, a wonderful brother over there, let me just stop this, I'll just stop the slideshow for a minute. So I can see this. A wonderful brother over there gave me this here. So this is not the trumpet, but this is, of course, a genuine ram's horn. And I've treasured that. And joining us this morning is the brother that gave this wonderful gift to me, Brother Arul. Welcome from Malaysia to have joined us today, if you're still there. All right, so that's our introduction of Passover. If anybody's got any comments, now's the time to jump aboard, show your cameras, your lovely faces, and turn on your mics if you'd like to make any comments.
Thank you, Brother Ron. I thought your comment about the dew was very powerful, especially when you consider that the manna was distilled as the dew.
Yes. This is another announcement, by the way, I need to make to everybody. Welcome, Brother TJ. I'm very excited to announce the fact that I sent out an invitation to TJ to continue some talks on this forum. So TJ's just jumped onto this forum, but TJ is going to be sharing some talks with us, and we'll discuss what that's going to be and the times those are going to be. So that's very exciting. Welcome, TJ. Thank you for your comments.